For those who are here randomly with nothing else to do, Nathan here has been involved in working in fonts for quite some time, and he's got some more fonty knowledge to share with us.
Font of wisdom was right then.
I've only had one cup of coffee today.
You don't want to be too obvious. That's
Yeah.
The font of coffee then.
Oops. So I did,
Get in there.
okay, things are happening.
All right. Now, why is that not coming up on here, though?
Well, there's difference between mirroring and
And the sharing.
yeah.
Ooh.
So I'm happy to start because I will have a question to start with.
You just crack on.
Okay, so
All right.
audience question first. How many people here can fluently, comfortably read a language other than English and French, let's say? Not a lot. Okay, do you know anyone who reads in like Arabic or in an Indic language? All right. Well, that is a lot of the world, which is one of the reasons why there's never a shortage of font things. I'm going to enable presenter mode. Any luck? Yay. Okay. Now the trickier bit is dragging where you can't see where the mouse is. All right. So what do you hit to maximize that? Is that F2, F4, something? Is that a real suggestion?
Yes.
It's not doing it. Right click, come on. Well, anyway, I'll talk while we feel like this should be obvious, but. So F11. Hey, second time's charm. Whew. All right. Thanks for sticking with me. I'm very happy to be here at all this year. I was actually supposed to give this talk or a version of it last year, and events conspired, and I couldn't travel, and I wasn't able to get there. I have slightly revisited the slides, so you don't hear all of 2024 information. But the official title may not mean a lot to you. It's supposed to be pithy, so it fits on, the grid. It's really, I always like to have like two slide titles, one that will go in the program and one that is what it's actually about. And this is what I had last year, because the idea is really that I'm going to talk about sort of pulling apart font files, figuring out what we can do with the insides, because we don't tend to think about the insides. This is my version of it for this year, which is to say it's kind of chaotic, and you don't necessarily need to embrace everything here, but I hope that there's some thought-provoking stuff in it. And while I'm at the beginning, I'm perfectly happy to have audience participation, and if you've got a question, raise your hand. Happy to interrupt. I'll repeat it into the mic so that the video people get it as well, but we can move right on. Old fonts. What do I mean by that? Not these. These are the file extensions you probably see the most often, right? TTF and OTF. I also don't mean these, the ones on the right you probably heard of, which are the WAF files. And these are screenshots from Nautilus. You might have also seen the one on the far left there, TTC. There's also an OTC, which I couldn't find a copy of. There's just not that many of them out there. But no, I mean these. Take a gander there. Anybody see an extension that they recognize by name? Yeah, in the back, which one?
Adobe Font Manager.
It is the same letters, but Adobe Font Metrics, I think, is what it is for this. Yeah, PCF, any takers? Maybe it sounds vaguely familiar. BDF, okay, well anyway, this is what we're talking about.
PDF is binary distribution font.
True. So old font files kind of had their support dropped from sort of the mainline desktop Linux stack a few years ago for reasons. It's not, not a random thing. And it's 2019, Pango stopped handling bitmap font files. And then harfbuzz, which is sort of what loads all the internals of a font from referencing a string. It's a little hard to pin down because there's different ways to use harfbuzz, but around the same time, 2017. The thing is that if you've ever booted your computer, you know that things like VGA settings and BIOS, there's still bitmap fonts there. Like those files never actually went away, especially, I mean, in general, in open source that's true, but especially in like Debian. I've still got a lot of them on my system. This is literally, again, just sort of sitting there in user share fonts. And it doesn't stop there. I didn't install these as far as I'm aware. You notice you don't get a preview on some of them, you do on others, but like the file manager still knows that the extension is somehow a font because it's showing you the letter A there. And then a lot of times you can open those files up and they sort of look like they still work. Like you can see shapes. The shapes look good to varying degrees. For whatever reason, this one you don't have that waterfall effect. Well, it's because this is a type 1 PostScript font. This is a bitmap font. But the font installer app knows what's inside of it because it's telling you, it tells you how many glyphs there are, and it knows a little bit about them, knows the style, but you can't actually install it. And actually I had to fake that screenshot because if you try to do that, it crashes. At least it does in my system. It could just be a temporary bug. So this gets people upset, right? Here's a bug report about that sort of thing. I don't recommend you read it because it's not really constructive, primarily because the bug reporters veer off a lot into just sort of talking about the intent of other people's actions, which is, hyperbolic, and they're projecting a lot of things there, and it's not going to go anywhere after that happens. But if you don't believe me that these arguments occur, you can find them. And honestly, I get why this bothers some people. It's sort of like it's in the realm of digital goods things. We have a lot of platitudes to say about how digital objects work and ought to work. And people who are used to those debates can feel really on edge. Like it worked yesterday. It seems to sort of work. Somebody broke something. So it's understandable that that's a frustrating experience. And the good news is that, at least with fonts, there is a way forward, which brings me to my ulterior motive for this presentation, which is to kind of build out the notion or understanding that font files aren't something opaque, which is sort of how we talk about them. They're not something that has to be like reverse engineered with safety gear on. They're pretty open. I completed a PhD in Reading, England, in typography last year, and a lot of the research part of that involved peeling back layers of the specifications, the font specifications, and that was valuable. The side way that's valuable is when I see people raging about old font formats, I realize that doesn't have to be the reaction. So I think like maybe talking more about what's inside of them will make them less controversial. And that opaqueness of the font file, it doesn't just happen to end users who are upset about something breaking on their system. FOSS developers will let some of that slip into discussion threads too. Here are 2 examples reworded by me so that you can't find the original sources. But yeah, that's not true. I mean, the first one there, it's definitely possible to compare fonts. That's just a misunderstanding. You probably solve that with an intervention or calling the authorities. But the second one there, that's the black box issue I was talking about. Like that's just not true. We can improve on that. We can show people how those things aren't the same. All right, audience participation again. What is in a font file? No wrong answers. Just shout something out. And nothing. Like there's something.
Examples of the font?
Sorry.
Examples of the font itself.
Examples of the font. Okay. Yeah. True. That's true.
All the shapes that's got these.
Shapes. Absolutely. Yes. Really glad someone said that. Anything else? Ligatures, right? Hinting? True. What was that? Pixels, sure. Sorry?
The origin point?
Oh yeah, the origin point, yeah. I don't know what that's about. Whew. Okay, well, here's a quasi-periodic table of stuff that could be in a font file, at least from a couple years ago. I made this for a different talk, and I've kept it around because it ended up being useful just to make people depressed. The things on the top half there, those are tables, top-level structures in a file, and I know you can't read all of them super well. If there's a really important one, I'll point it out. The bottom half, loosely, is well-defined bits and other functional chunks that are sort of embedded in other tables, because some of them are kind of nested like that. That would include things like the OpenType features, the name strings, sample strings, metrics, other things like that. They're sort of sorted by me. The ones that are in magenta are ones that are not really implemented anywhere. The ones that are in black are unique to Apple fonts. The ones that are in red are unique to Adobe. The sort of teal there is stuff that's a specific open source application, has a table of its own. Usually like settings. So if you used TTF auto hint to do the hinting, it leaves a record of what the settings were so you can reproduce that and debug it later. But let's forget about that. What do you really need in a font file? I think people said the obvious one, which is shapes. I would say the bare bones, there's some shapes, and you have to have some way to link a shape to some chunk of language. And that could just be implied. And if you go back to really old, like think about how video game Atari fonts worked, that how it's associated might just be the order that it's in. So you have to have the shapes in the right order of the alphabet, and if you are missing one, it's all garbled. And the further back you go in font file formats, the closer you get to that. It's some shapes, and you just have to know what they mean. But we live in the modern world, right? And we have this massive selection of stuff. Now, the gold line, sort of in the circle there, is what OpenType is, which is it's a line that says if you have these tables, it's an OpenType font. The blue one is TrueType. Those tables, it's a TrueType font. You'll notice there's a whole lot of mix and match left over out there. And that's another misconception that people have, is that like TrueType and OpenType are mutually exclusive. They're mostly the same, actually, and they're just brand names from Apple and Microsoft. But that flexibility is something we can exploit when we're trying to figure out how this old font file that doesn't work anymore could be made to work again. So the shapes, they call them glyphs in the type business, which is just Greek. They can be in any one of those tables. And the ones on the left there are the vector shapes that we're used to. Glyph is the table that Apple created for that. CFF and 1 and 2 are what Adobe created for PostScript. The ones on the right there are raster images, which is how we got emojis, and people like emojis. I think that EBDT and CBDT are the same, just that C lets you have color, and SPIX, I think, was the Apple one. I'm pretty sure it's just the same old Apple graphics format. So I think it's like a PNG, but it just doesn't have all the wrapper stuff around it. And as I was mentioning, a lot of those other tables, is where fonts will put things that aren't just the shapes. It's where they have that like mapping to the language. And it's also where all the system integration things happen, which is why you can't necessarily use an old font on a modern system, because that system integration piece is just not there. Like style matching, is it bold or italic? You might get lucky and it says that on the name of the font, but if not, how do you know, like when an application like LibreOffice or something, if you click the bold button, it needs to find another font. How does it, that's like system integration stuff. Or how tall is it supposed to be with the lines? How do you attach diacritics to things? We don't have those things in the old font formats. You can't, you have to build separate code paths to handle every old format like that. That's why they can't be used in the modern stack. No one wants to have a bunch of special cases. And I went through those discussions trying to figure out what things people were wanting to do with the old files, because they thought it's worth looking at what the actual task is, because there might be some of those that are better than others. And let me be clear, not everybody is trying their hardest to play nice. There are some people who just don't want to cooperate. But I looked at those discussions and I came up with several things that I think are varying degrees of importance with old font files. So I want to talk about those and maybe figure out which ones would be something we could accommodate and which ones aren't. A corner case on one end, you have an old document, the contract you signed 15 years ago with your employer. what did it actually say? Did it actually specify that thing that they say it did, or did that line get cut off at the end of the page? Well, if you need to know that, you can't just reflow it with a different font today. You need to have the actual way that it looked back then. So yeah, good cause if you want to do that. On the other hand, accommodating that, you really want to do something like a VM for that, right? You don't want to just worry about the font, you got to worry about the whole context of it. So I don't know that we can do a lot about that. Other end of the spectrum, what if you like the aesthetics and you want to use it for something creative? If you're into like retro tech or cyberpunky looking things, I think we should be all for that. You know, if you want to do something fun with a vintage computing font or with a old Atari game font, yeah, let's see if we can do that. The reason that might be something we could accommodate is that it's not general purpose. You're using it for your project. You're making an image for your web page, or you're making a game element or something like that. You're not trying to use it for your email. I mean, I for one, maybe I'm alone, but if people want to work on creative projects, we want them to do that on free software and on Linux boxes. We're all enriched by that because we get to play the games and those things. And there's variety about those things. Like, they might be making a game, and game engines, if you haven't done game programming, they tend to still use bitmap fonts in a lot of cases just to reduce overhead. People who care about retro computing things, they're looking for the original thing, not a later recreation. Whether they have the provenance to actually use those old files that they've posted online, that's their problem. But yeah, this is a big topic, and so I think it's the one that's probably the most interesting for the Linux community to say, let's try and make that work. This is a book by a type designer who lives in London that I know, named Toshi Omagari. And this is like the best-selling font book ever, and it's just from a few years ago. And it's because this is about arcade fonts and things. People still like those. I'm old enough that I see the old Macintosh fonts like Chicago, and that elicits a reaction because it's the first thing that I used when I was a kid and we got a computer. I do want to point out, though, that if font aesthetics are something you want, there are people making modern fonts that have that, or attempt to have that vibe. There's just not a lot of them. There's everything on Google Fonts that I could find that is intentionally bitmap looking, and there's a couple of variations of some of them. But yeah, not a lot to choose from. So you don't have to go down this path, but it's possible. Another way that people might need to use a bitmap or an old font is on hardware, like OLED screens and LCD screens and things. They generally are bitmap only, and that's again because of resources available. But a very different system. It's not a desktop Linux system. If you were at Kit's talk yesterday, which is about audio interfaces, you might have also seen this, which I didn't know was going to happen, but this is the latest in augmented reality, which is a very low resolution bitmap thing that is reflected into your glasses. And yeah, there's always going to be stuff like that. Like the resolution of an Oculus, one of the most recent VR headset, is a lot better than the previous generation was, but it's still a lot lower resolution than a monitor is or than a phone is. And that's always going to be to save money. The newest one is going to be low resolution. The next one is going to bump that up a little bit. But if that's not a great font in your opinion, I don't know, could you improve on that? You might want to, that's all I'm saying. We're kind of into the corner cases now, so I think the big ones are covered. But there's projects like, this is CHDK. Is anybody familiar with that? It's a firmware for Canon digital cameras. It loads from the memory card, so you don't overwrite anything. Lots of extra features. I love it, it's great. It uses bitmap fonts. And if you want to write the user manual for that, how do you show that? Like, you take a picture of the camera with another camera, you're going to inception yourself into a bad image that way. So yeah, it's pretty niche, but these things exist, and I don't know. They're on the list of things I came up with, is basically what it boils down to. I think the last one here, there are devices like laser cutters and things that don't use normal fonts because they can't. PCB etching is the same way. It's a single path, and you're gonna have to do something different. You can't go through FreeType and HeartFuzz to work with those things. And for everything else, like there are people who just have the old fonts and they want to use them. And I don't think most of them paid a lot of money for a font in the 80s, but there are people who bought, like, you used to get these things the size of a phone book. It was like 500 fonts on it. And if you spent that much money on it, maybe you do feel more strongly that you don't want it to go to waste. And I don't know. When I looked at that list of things, like forensics people, we probably shouldn't try to, give them legal advice. People making games and retro cyberpunk things, yeah, let's aim for that. Other stuff in the middle, you might have to meet us halfway. And if you want to use your old fonts, you might have to meet us a little bit halfway too. So I actually want to start with that case because it's probably the easiest to understand. Type 1 fonts or PostScript fonts, they're the most like a modern font. They're vectors, that kind of thing. So what does meet us halfway mean for those fonts? Well, again, they're going to be at least 10 years old, probably longer than that. But at the technical level, OpenType, importantly, was created to be a superset of this PostScript font. So it is the easiest thing to fix. I think I've got at the end of the slides a video about how that works from Adobe's perspective. So you can upconvert, in a sense, the old Type 1 font into an OpenType font, completely modern. You just have to fill in a little bit of data. I also wanted to note that you see a lot of tech and CTAN people talk about these fonts. Most of the ones that are available through CTAN are actually more modern OpenType fonts, sort of back converted for older engines. So that's not what we're talking about. Now in the proprietary software world, you can pay $100 to translate something from an old Type 1 font into an OpenType font. We can do better things with that ourselves because we can just use free software to do it. Inside one of these things, you're going to get cubic Beziers. That limits us a little bit. You're going to get 256 glyphs total, which is not a lot. It does have an external character mapping, but normally those are all kind of the same. And it usually has those AFM, those metrics files separately. Also, you only have 4 style choices: regular, italic, bold, or bold italic. But we know where those things fit. So this is the image again. The green arrows show you where those bits that exist in the old Type 1 font actually should go. Now in the third column there, the 2 red options, CFF or CFF2, those are where shapes go in a PostScript formatted OpenType font. They're slightly different. CFF2, obviously newer. Top left there, CMap, that's what source character mapping. But again, we kind of know what that is since it's pretty standardized. So the way you would do this is with a tool called Make OTF. Sounds very official. If you look at the address there, Adobe Type Tools produces that. It's produced by Adobe, and it's because it was created for this purpose. This is what Adobe uses internally to take its sources, its PostScript sources, and make OpenType fonts out of them. So you could do this yourself. There's a few minor choices you have to make, but if you hear someone complain about a Type 1 font, this is what they should do. The inputs are pretty simple. The command at the end there, if you have a feature file, I've highlighted that in red, that's sort of like the ligatures and things like that, kerning. R means release mode, which is part of Adobe's production. GF lets you specify a glyph ordered database. You use the default one unless you know otherwise. Like if you worked at Adobe, you'd know otherwise. B and I are options that tell the builder to use the bold or the italic or both flags. And I've looked around. The only thing I've found that would be in one of those feature files is kerning. Like the FM files that you see on a lot of fonts distributed in Linux have kerning in one of those. But that's about it. There could be other things, but easily handled. Like I said, the encoding bit, it's not necessarily going to be standard, but it almost always is. Apart from the single command on the previous slide, a pretty decent option is that third paragraph down there. There's a repo called type1.otf, which gives you a sort of batch processing tool that will batch process, convert all of the Type 1 fonts on your system into OTF form, which it's worth a shot. I've done that. I got got tired of messing with it, honestly, but it didn't throw errors or anything like that. You have an alternative, though, if that scares you a little bit, which is FontForge. FontForge still exists. It's getting old and not great at doing a lot of things anymore, but it can still handle old fonts really well. You do get a GUI to edit things with that if you want, and they have a tutorial on the docs page about that. The thing is, it's going to take a lot more of your time because FontForge is not set up to do this. So you will have to step through every sort of vertical tab on that left-hand column and fill in all those fields for you. And you're probably, I mean, you're probably not going to come up with anything you couldn't have done with the command line tool, but it's an option. And that might be something you need to do if, say, you need Polish support and the font you're using doesn't have the L with /3. Maybe you draw that yourself. That's up to you. So I look at that like current state of affairs. I think accommodation is pretty doable there. The thing is, it doesn't really scale. Like each individual person has to do this. A lot of the old fonts that exist have these quirky licenses from before it was standardized, and so you can't update the font packages for the most part. So I don't know, maybe the thing to do to defuse arguments there is just boost the tools. Maybe there's some wrappers you could do, but for the most part, if you just say, hey man, I know the feeling, let me show you what you can do, and we can fix that up. That's a way to make a positive impact there. A little more fun is the bitmap font case. Hang on a second, let me fix one thing here. There we go. So this is a website that is just for FNT formatted game fonts, and there's a lot of them. This is a screenshot of the top of the very first page. The challenge with bitmap fonts is that there's a bunch of different formats. Type 1, there was one. And they also have very little metadata. Kind of two paths forward to choose to. You can either keep it a bitmap font but try and make it work in a modern system, or you can turn it into a vector font. When I say font formats, there's way more than the ones listed here. These are just the most common. Notably, the Mac version thing, that is like when they had a resource fork and data fork files, if anyone remembers that. Not as much documentation on that stuff. Font and FNT are usually the Windows formats, but there's also other people who used FNT as their file format. In fact, that gaming site I just showed the screenshot of is FNT files for something else, for a device from 2019 called the Playdate. I hadn't heard of this until like a couple months ago, but it was a little Kickstarter crowdfunded thing that's sort of like handheld thing, and it had a crank. Yeah. Do you have one?
No.
I've never met anybody who has one, but people can. I think it's either hackable or they let you load your own games to it, so people are collecting a lot of game resources and things. Anyway, you'll see that on a lot of old devices where the font was not meant to be portable. They have a file extension on it because they needed to designate what it was. It was burned into ROM or firmware or something. To get a better feel in general, I'm just going to look at BDF. BDF is the one from Adobe, bitmap distribution format. It's meant to be cross-platform. Adobe didn't sell hardware, and so for that reason, it's probably the most common. Not a lot here. It's in text format, and so you get the font name, you get some point sizes, which are important in the old days. There's overall bounding box. You need to know that for like text layout. And then you have a bunch of blocks for each individual glyph. The glyph, each one has its own metrics. You can see that you have an encoding number that's a reference to Adobe's encoding. And then, it's kind of got an origin defined there, which may not be the leftmost bottom left point. But that's how you have things like descenders and like overhangs and things like that. Actually, inside most of the formats, and like most of the other bitmap formats are something like this. They might be structured differently. They might just give you an offset and then have all the bits together. I don't know. But most of them, they aren't just 1 and 0 bits for the actual characters. They're sort of compressed into hex. So as you can all immediately recognize, 7E is the top line there. And that's what you'd see. You could, again, if you want to poke around, open those in FontForge. This is an example, actual PCF bitmap font. PCF is an X font. Did I mention that? It was on the slide before, but X11 fonts used PCF. If you've used FontForge before, I'm sorry. If you need a hug later, let me know. But you'll notice that the canvas that you see there doesn't have a lot of tools on it. There's a pencil and like a line thing. That's how you know that it's actually showing a bitmap and not just a bunch of square shapes on it. Now, if we compare what we saw in the PDF file to that periodic table, we might know enough to fill in the character map. We have some metrics for each of those fonts, and we have like the font name. As far as the actual glyph shapes, we've got black and white pixels, so we can't use those vector formats that we were expecting to. Like, could we put them into one of those raster tables, though? We still need to link them into the language parts, though. Turns out we can. If you remember that list of places where the shapes could live, here it is again. All three of those on the right, those are bitmaps. So couldn't you just put the bitmaps you have into those tables? Turns out you can. You take the original bitmaps from an old bitmap font, you put them into one of those tables, and you're kind of good to go. And when I say good to go, I mean this is not a hack. This works. Like the OTB file extension was invented by the Xorg, X11 people for this purpose. It was meant to be the replacement for PCF. Like I think literally Keith Packard was the one who came up with this, and in his infinite wisdom but finite time, it just sort of never happened. And vector font support picked up in X. And this is still supported in HarfBuzz and FreeType and other parts of the stack. There are several conversion options that you can go download and use for this purpose right now. I think last year I had identified 4. I think I found like 6 now. I'm going to talk about 2 which work really well and which have kind of different intents. The first one is called font to SNFT. SNFT is the general structure of all those things. You find that in the xfont utils package. It means I think it was probably what they were going to use to do the conversion of the PCF fonts. And the other one's on GitHub. The first one there just does the bitmap from the original font into the new table. The second one does that and then also traces the bits into little squares as vectors. It is a little bit trickier to use because it requires Python, and FontForge's Python bindings can't be installed by pip. It's sort of a packaging thing. It's been needing to be fixed for a while, and I think there's just some hurdles. How do you use it? The S7T one, by default, it just puts all of the encoding information according to Unicode. Definitely the right way to do it. Raster glyphs. The downside of it, also it creates an empty glyph table, which is the TrueType format one. Remember, glyph was inside the circle, the blue circle for TrueType, so you don't necessarily have to have anything in it, apparently, but it exists. The table is there. You can't say it's not there, so it's definitely a TrueType font. The tricky bit here is that it only works for BDF fonts these days. PCF and BDF are more or less the same, so that's not a big impediment. But this is an OTB that I converted from BDF using this tool. That's Lucida Bright, which is a very famous font from Bigelow and Holmes, people who worked on a lot of early Mac and Adobe fonts. And this is actually the same BDF that I showed you in that Nautilus screenshot at the beginning. And again, you'll see just the pencil and the line tool in FontForge. So it's just bitmaps. The alternative to this is that GitHub project, bitmap font to OTB, does the same thing, also traces each of the bit pixels into a square. This one explicitly allows you to use PCF as an input. I think you could probably patch the xfont util one to do that too. It just hasn't been done. Not a lot of options to give it there. Don't rename it. Ignore the encoding. I don't remember why. It hasn't really been updated in a while, but again, it works. This is the result of doing that with no additional options. I randomly chose one from that file chooser before, but you can see on the right that is a vector canvas. Those squares are paths. So it has traced each pixel in the bitmap and made it into a separate square. It's a little wasteful, maybe. They could probably combine those, but one step at a time, right? More importantly, this font now exists as a font that you can install on your system. This is the font installer for GNOME. This is LED fixed, which was in that Nautilus screenshot before as well. This time, if we hit the install button, it installs, which I can prove to you because here it is in LibreOffice in the font menu. It's a little bit light because it's being rendered in the pixel font, but you can use it in a document. Perfect, right? Nothing seems off about that at all? No complaints? Yeah, well, that's the territory we're in. And this is again why I think I would refer to this as accommodation for people doing projects rather than restoring support for an old font format. The little quirky thing you see there is, I think, LibreOffice trying to auto-replace the straight quote character with a curly quote, but it does it without checking to see if there is a curly quote in the font first. That is clearly a LibreOffice bug, but you're going to see there's a lot, and you can't do a lot about it. Where does this go for the future? I mean, I think the process is pretty smooth. I didn't do a lot of extra work to use either of those tools, but I mean, should that happen automatically? Should that be an app that anyone can download and use? Should that be built into the font managing application? If you want to talk about the massive collections of bitmap fonts on those sites, it would be trickier to try and mass convert those because they're going to have a bunch of different formats. The encodings are not going to be the same. Metadata is messed up. And then I guess I still think that like the game design case is different enough that I'm not a game designer. I don't know. If you do game design, I'd be interested to hear if you were making like a text mode game, you might want an OS supported font. If you're doing one that has a game engine instead, what's the workflow like for you? I'd really be curious to hear that. And of course, I also want to add, you do have to worry about, are there tools to do all these different format conversions? I found, with just a few minutes of searching, converters for every one of those pairs and more that I didn't include. So it's possible. And I did want to add also that the OTB or vector conversion thing, I think that is the right fit for people doing the documentation cases I mentioned. So I think that's okay. Now, the last section, I want to skim through. I had a lot more to say about this before, but I feel like I don't really know it as well. So we'll go through this pretty quickly. You can talk to me later if you want, but like, you know, the laser cutting thing that uses a different kind of font or the matrix displays, what can we do about that? I'm not clear. I mean, single stroke path fonts go back a long way. This is Hershey fonts from 1967 for CRT displays like oscilloscope rendering, straight line segments. People still make them today though. This is a 2024 release. Mostly these are not standard desktop applications. It's the thing for your laser cutter that you run, specialty apps. Also don't have the same hurdles. People seem to sort of use fonts that just don't behave according to the spec. Like this is a true type font, but it's a single path. So you might see this in your font menu, but you wouldn't see it if you tried to type in LibreOffice. They just pass these around on the laser cutter forums though. So I don't know how you handle that. There's no bridging that gap. There's no automatically closing those things. You know, it might be that there's some way to get past that and turn it into a compliant font, but I haven't really identified it. There is the SVG table. I think that's possible. I've found some people who do that, where they take one of these single path fonts and turn it into an SVG instead. And that seems to be partially supported in Inkscape. I've actually found a GitHub project that is using that explicitly, and there are some tools for that. But yeah, I don't know if I don't know if I consider myself well versed enough in people's workflow to say that this is what you should do. Again, FontForge could do it. I don't know. As far as the character displays go, you know, loading things into a little. Actually, I brought one with me. I should turn this on at the beginning. I got this as a badge thing at something a year ago. They, you know, they are all device specific. So you load those in using the board's IDE or library. And there's certainly going to be new hardware that has different requirements. I don't know if you're like a hardware matrix display person. I'm not confident I know what the workflow is like. Would you want different font loading options to be in the IDE standalone? You tell me. I'm serious. I don't know where to talk to those people, so I'd love to hear what you think. So I'm going to end on this note here, which is I hope maybe we can consider that old font formats weren't things that were done incorrectly. It's just a different set of constraints they had to work with, so the content is still potentially nice and useful. It's not easy to draw curves using only straight lines. It's less easy when you have to do it 200 times, make them work together. But that's where I want to end. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on any of the little sub pieces in there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Nathan. We are actually technically going into lunchtime, but if anyone's got any quick questions now, we can go through them, or you can you'll be around
Yep, I'll be
for the
around.
rest of the trip,
Yeah.
rest of the event, should I say? Okay, in the meantime, I would love to present you with this lovely, it's been handmade and designed by one of our locals, who's also one of our volunteers,
Well, thank you very
for
much.
you to display with pride as being one of our speakers this year.
Right.
Thank you
Thank you.
very much.